Welcome to Next in Tech, an S&P Global Market Intelligence podcast where the world of emerging tech lives. I'm your host, Eric Hanselman, Chief Analyst for Technology, Media, and Telecom at S&P Global Market Intelligence. And today, we're going to be talking about the Cloud Price Index. And to explore that with me is Ellie Brown. Ellie, welcome back to the podcast.
Awesome. Thanks for having me.
You're moving from all sorts of different topics. We've had you on talking about quantum and now cloud. There are just all sorts of things that we can potentially dig into.
Yeah, it's one of the best parts about this job, right? Is that I get to talk about all of the most fun, exciting stuff. And computing is a pretty big box. So I dabble in the quantum, I dabble in the cloud, and it's just a great way to look at the world, I guess.
And on the cloud side, there's a lot to talk about. It's been quite a while since we've talked about the Cloud Price Index. There's a lot that's been going on, but because of the long time and since the last we've covered it, maybe you could give our listeners a little bit of background into what the Cloud Price Index is, what it's all about, what does it represent?
Yeah, so the Cloud Price Index is one of 451 Research's kind of original tools, and it existed in some form or another all the way back since 2015. So we have a long ways of tracking this data that we look at. So it started at the end of 2015. At the time, cloud pricing was all over the place, right? Cloud looked a little bit different back then than it does now. Still some of the similar services, but there was a lot of, confusion about cloud pricing, whether cloud was any better as a use case, a service for users to interact with, and how much that would cost and how much potentially users could save if they moved their workloads to the cloud.
You seem to be implying that there's not confusion today.
Oh, no, we're getting to that, right? But that was the impetus, right, for creating the tool. So yes, still much confusion, right? But that's kind of the driving force, and has always been the driving force behind the Cloud Price Index, is to take all of that confusion and try and help distill all of this pricing information about the cloud down for our users, and hopefully provide some transparency and actionable insights for users trying to manage their cloud costs to the best of their ability, right?
Well, to the best of their ability. But also, I think the thing that you pointed out is really, a couple important parts. One, the longitudinal data and the history. I remember back in the very early days when we were looking at the growth of the number of different products and really the SKU counts of exactly how many different products were all the various vendors actually offering. Those numbers are dwarfed by what we see today.
Yes, exactly. So when we first started the Cloud Price Index, we only tracked a couple of different services in North America. And over time, it has definitely evolved. So right now, every quarter, we pull over 5 million lines of raw pricing data. So much, much more than at the beginning. And we filter all of that down into, again, those insights, right? Because it's all really good information, but that is a lot of data for anybody to work through. So pulling out, the key prices, making comparisons between similar services. You don't want just this huge data file. You want, information to help you figure out what you want to do with your cloud and how much that's going to cost. So we pull from AWS, Google Cloud, Azure, IBM, and Alibaba to kind of give us that nice, good global spread of some of the biggest cloud providers in the space right now.
Well, and that the index itself is based on a set of core configurations that are really not dissimilar to the consumer price index in terms of how it's built.
Yeah, exactly. So I actually make that comparison quite often when I'm trying to explain the Cloud Price Index, and it's frankly not helped very much because we sometimes simplify Cloud Price Index to CPI, which is the same as Consumer Price Index, right? Lots of confusion there. But the Cloud Price Index also uses kind of a basket of goods mentality, which is one used by the Consumer Price Index, which has obviously been in the news recently, along with all the inflation numbers. So that's usually a nice, good correlation that people are able to track and follow. So they're very similar in scope that way. The Cloud Price Index just focuses on the cloud naturally.
Well, and because of the growth, there's actually been some significant changes, actually some of those relatively recently in what's been taking place in CPI and the way the data gets presented.
Yeah. So we used to present all of this information in an Excel document, which is great and good and standard. But as we pulled data every quarter for the past 8 years, that Excel file gets really, really big, lots of tabs along the bottom. And it's hard to see that really good longitudinal data that we do have. It just didn't track very well. As the cloud price index has grown and evolved, and we've had this really big pool of data, we wanted a new way to represent it and allow easy access for our users to really dig in and interact with the information in ways that work best for them. So at the end of last year, we transformed the CPI. We moved it outside of its just little Excel box and plugged it into Power BI, which has been really phenomenal because we can have that big data set in the back end. And then users can interact with just the pieces that they want to look at. We have a lot more visual options for them in terms of graphics and charts that help really represent the changes that we've been seeing, not just in a numerical format, but in a visualization that gives you a really good broad level and high level view of all of the big moves in this space. And with the nice filters that we have on Power BI, users can really dig in and focus on regions or services that they care about, right? So we track regions all around the world. Maybe you're a European user and you really just care about European cloud prices. We can filter that down in a much easier way, and you can really let it be customized to the cloud prices and services that users care about.
To your point, being able to actually leverage the full set of data, but to be able to do it with tools that aren't as overwhelming, that don't put as much of a burden on spreadsheet wrangling, to be able to actually get that all done. Yet the new graphics are great, and just simply being able to actually dig into the data with that additional level of detail, and at the same time with a level of ease that now makes it a lot simpler to be able to extract insights into movements in these markets, how you actually plan, what your expectations are about where things are headed. The thing I always found fascinating is all of the tracking of new service offerings that kick up, and really watching what's happening in each of the providers, seeing where they're headed and watching as you get new instance types that crop up, and watching how that evolution actually happens to move forward.
Yeah, that's one of the things that I've really enjoyed, even personally, with the new visualization suite is it makes my life as an analyst much easier, right? Because I can go in and see right off the bat, oh, well, we've added this service. There's a lot in generative AI, of course, right now, but also just regionally and globally where these hyperscalers are choosing to put their services and if that has changed over time. So it's really great as that high level tool to see that change happening. It's almost like a cockpit level view where you can see everything happening all at once and see where those intersections take place, which is excellent for writing reports and putting analysis together.
It's one of those things that watching services roll out across regions, because of course you get the initial announcement of whatever the capability happens to be, but then it's not available in all the regions yet. The great thing about some of the CPI data is not only can you watch pricing trends, but you can also watch the availability of functionality within regions and watch the trending there as well.
Exactly. And we actually have a lot of our users that's their primary use case for the cloud price index is they use it to kind of track and see where these regions have these services rolling out and sometimes get ahead of the game, right? If there's a big hole in a region that doesn't have a specific service or service type, some of these alternative cloud providers can hop in there and use that to inform their own product roadmap, which is an interesting take on the tool, right? It doesn't have to be just pricing, to your point. It's also the ecosystem as a whole.
Speaking of use cases, we've talked to Melanie Posey and Gina Telsek have been on talking about what has been this, I keep saying nascent movement, but now if we think about FinOps and where it's gone, this has really moved beyond nascent to now being a much more mainstream effort to be able to manage cloud costs. How are focuses on FinOps changing how people are leveraging CPI and some of their approaches to managing cloud?
Right. So, I mean, the big thing with FinOps is the push for standardization and transparency, right? It's kind of this two-pronged approach. One of the nice things about the Cloud Price Index is that we've been doing that sort of standardization process for a long time now. We do apples to apples comparisons of these services and we sort them into categories. We standardize how everything is put together. And frankly, it has been a lot of work, right? Because there's all sorts of different cloud provider preferences for how services are named and even the units that they're sold in. So it's been quite a lift, right, to be able to make those comparisons. But with FinOps, the push is to simplify that, right? So it's not that heavy of a lift. Users will have more insight. They can compare across the board, right? So, from the Cloud Price Index standpoint, that's a great thing for us because it makes my life much easier, right? There's a lot less that we'll have to do to dig through that information and try and provide those comparisons. The second thing that FinOps is really pushing for is that transparency and cost, right? As we talked about at the beginning of this kind of chat, cloud costs have been nebulous, they're confusing. There's so many
Almost
services.
cloudy.
Imagine that, right? I wonder if
Who
someone
knew?
did it on purpose. But yeah, it's been crazy that there's just a lot of confusion. And as a consumer, if you're purchasing something and if you're spending that much money, right? These cloud services, they can make up a substantial part of any enterprise budget. So obviously you want transparency into how much you're paying, how much you will pay, and make sure you're getting a good bang for your buck, right? So the cloud price index really neatly fits into kind of that tenet of FinOps because it provides that transparency. It provides a one-stop shop to showcase where prices are high, where they're low, and allow users to compare among regions and even across cloud providers and have that insight without having to do that digging and that manual work that up till now has kind of been required.
Well, and having that data normalized across providers also gives people the ability to not have to do those instance comparisons of, oh, wait a minute, this is like this is like that. Yeah, and to do something that's at least a little more objective comparison in terms of what's available on different platforms and what they should be looking for and what they can expect.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, we've seen a lot of hybrid cloud users that have these combinations, right? They find that one cloud provider might be ideal for a specific section of their cloud usage, but maybe another provider has better options elsewhere. And so allowing that easy access into that information, it can enable these users to most effectively roll out their clouds not just for price, but for performance and know that they're getting not just a good deal, but also a service that will work the way that they want it to work.
Well, and from a FinOps perspective, also one that you've got some visibility into what those future costs look like. If you know what the sizing is going to look like, you can help to figure out exactly what your overall deployed cost might look like, and take a look at that deployed cost and see how it varies by region. It's one of those interesting things that I've had client conversations where you've got folks who are looking to roll out globally and are trying to figure out both what those cost differences are going to be. Again, you're trying to get applications that are closer to end users, so you want to be in region. You may have data sovereignty concerns, so you might want to be in a particular region. But of course, if there are variations in terms of cost, it's useful to be able to build that into your budgets to understand what's going to happen when you actually make those changes.
Yeah. I mean, it all depends on that information, right? The more information you have, the more access to that information, the easier it is, the better your choices are going to be as you roll out.
So we've talked about some of the high-level aspects. I'm curious, what are the recent trends you're seeing in data? Well, what are some highlights about what you've seen coming out of the CPI recently?
Yeah. So one of the biggest things has been kind of this ongoing, I guess, story for the past couple of years. We've had a lot of replacements of virtual machines. So we, as the Cloud Price Index team, don't just track a standard VM, the same one that we were looking at in 2015, right? That wouldn't make any sense. We want to be tracking the information and the standardized use case for these instance types. So as new VMs roll out, we keep a close eye on those to determine when they're actually being used and adopted by the market, right? So that we have actual real world pricing information. We aren't just using an out of date VM instance for our pricing benchmarks. So we've been seeing the replacement of these old VM instances with newer versions, and that's been happening for years, right? But interestingly, over the past couple of years, those instance types have actually been priced much higher for the newer instances. Back in the day, we used to see this just really sharp decrease in price. So new instances would roll out, but they'd be priced cheaper than the older ones. And so the cloud pricing was actually going down substantially. And early last year, that trend shifted. And these newer instance types are priced higher. They do have better price performance, according to the hyperscalers, but they're pricing higher, which is driving the benchmark up. So that's been a really interesting shift in mentality that we hadn't seen up until recently. It pivoted and turned that VM instance understanding on its head. So those have gone up over time. So that's been very interesting there. It's just kind of this break with the historical trend.
It's been one of those sort of tropes in technology. It's new generations are faster, smaller, cheaper. But and that had been the trend on the cloud side, but there's now, I guess, a move by some of the providers to be able to hang on to some of that value. And I think that there's also that shift in terms of an expectation about how they're going to be adapting their fleets of back-end hardware to support that. Back in the day, there was an awful lot of replacement in the environment itself. So trying to maintain older instance types maybe created a lot more overhead. Now you've got an environment where just simply the scale of most of these environments can actually maintain those older instance types. So there's less pressure to get people to move off them. And they now get to go grab, or I guess retain a bit more of that value with the new instance types. And granted, on a cost per compute, yes, you're doing better, but it's not going to be the same dramatic shift that you saw in new instance introductions years ago.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, because you aren't getting that compound pricing decrease, right? So you aren't getting the benefit of the cost per compute, but along with the cheaper instance price, right? It kind of balances out there. So that's been really interesting to keep an eye on. And it's been fun to watch it have these VMs sweep across the globe, right? They'll roll out in one instance, in one region, and then they'll go to a new region and then spread out slowly over time. I'm not sure why, but France is always the last region, it seems like, in Europe to receive any of the new stuff. So that's kind of the cloud price index tip of the day. France is always the last rollout region. So that's been fun to watch. But
interesting. That's if there's a wave, it reaches the French shores last.
It does, yes. And then, of course, right, the second thing is AI. So there's just been such a...
I've heard about that.
Oh, just once or twice, right? No, it's touching the cloud world as well. No surprise. But it's actually led to some really interesting changes in the cloud price index as generative AI has really rolled out. The hyperscalers have really shifted their funding away from a lot of their previous expansion plans in favor of pushing that generative AI agenda. So we've seen this global slowdown of regional expansion. Instead of rolling out new data centers, they've actually been closing, in some instances, local regions around the world so that they can reallocate that funding to generative AI projects.
Interesting. It's one more place where generative AI is being disruptive in so many different dimensions.
Yeah. So this quarter alone, I've been digging through the data, and Alibaba just announced that they're shutting down their India region and their Australia region. So that's definitely going to make some waves over in the Asia Pacific area of the globe.
Oh, wow. Huh. retrenching, I guess. Again, you got to be able to target investment in places where you're going to optimize its performance.
Yeah,
So,
exactly.
wow. So, in terms of leveraging the CPI, I'm curious, what are your thoughts about how organizations should really think about working with the CPI and building out infrastructure and dealing with cloud more broadly?
Yeah, so a lot of the FinOps push has naturally gone around provisioning, right? Making sure you're only provisioning for the instances you need. And that's definitely a great start. But from the pricing side, you also want to make sure you're doing your homework and getting the best deal. Like, as with anything, it would just be a shame to have this other alternative that has the same performance, is in the same location that you want it to be,